Before time began, the Almighty chose one man to fulfill his eternal covenant, a deliverer who would lead his people from bondage to freedom. Prophesied through generations, Moses was destined to become the vessel of God's divine judgment upon Egypt and the architect of Israel's salvation. Witness the unfolding of heavenly prophecy as the Lord of hosts demonstrates his supremacy over false gods, unleashing supernatural plagues that declare his sovereignty. See how the great I Am orchestrates every detail, from the crying of Hebrew babies to the drowning of Pharaoh's army, all according to his perfect, predetermined plan. This is not merely the story of a man, but the revelation of God's prophetic timeline, where every miracle points to his ultimate redemption of mankind through the coming Messiah. Prepare to witness the divine blueprint of deliverance unfold before your very eyes. Years had passed since Joseph saved Egypt from famine, and now a new king ruled who didn't remember what Joseph had done. The book of Exodus tells us in chapter 1, verse 8, "Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph." This Pharaoh looked at the Hebrew people and saw something that frightened him. They had grown strong and many in number. What started as 70 people coming to Egypt had become a mighty nation within his borders. Fear gripped the Egyptian king's heart. He worried that if war came, these Hebrews might join Egypt's enemies and fight against him. So he made a terrible decision. Exodus chapter 1 verse 11 reveals his cruel plan. Therefore they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. The Hebrews, once honored guests in Egypt, became slaves, forced to make bricks and build cities under the burning desert sun. Every day brought fresh misery. Egyptian masters cracked whips over Hebrew backs, demanding more work with less rest. The people who once lived freely now groaned under heavy loads of clay and straw. Their hands became raw from making bricks, their backs bent from carrying stones, and their hearts broke from the endless suffering. Yet even in this darkness, something amazing happened. Exodus chapter 1 verse 12 tells us, "But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew." The more Egypt tried to crush them, the stronger the Hebrew people became. God was watching over his chosen people, even in their darkest hour. When harsh labor failed to stop the Hebrew population from growing, Pharaoh's heart turned even more wicked. He called for the Hebrew midwives, 2 brave women named Shiphrah and Puah. His orders were simple and horrifying: kill every Hebrew baby boy at birth. But these women feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. Exodus chapter 1 verse 17 shows their courage. But the midwives feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. When Pharaoh discovered that baby boys were still being born alive, he became furious. The midwives cleverly told him that Hebrew women were stronger than Egyptian women and gave birth before they could arrive to help. God blessed these faithful women for protecting innocent lives. Exodus chapter 1 verse 20 records God's reward. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. But Pharaoh's rage only grew darker. He decided to involve all his people in this evil plan. Exodus chapter 1 verse 22 records his terrible command. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, "Every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall save alive." Now every Egyptian became part of this horrible plan. Hebrew mothers lived in terror, knowing that any Egyptian could take their newborn sons and throw them into the Nile River. The crocodile-filled waters became a grave for innocent babies. This was the dark world into which Moses would be born. In the tribe of Levi lived a man named Amram and his wife Jochebed, whose love would defy a king's cruel order. When this woman gave birth to a son, she looked at her baby and saw something special. Exodus chapter 2 verse 2 tells us, "And the woman conceived and bare a son, and when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months." This wasn't just any baby. There was something about him that filled his mother's heart with hope instead of fear. For 3 long months, she kept her son hidden in their home. Can you imagine the stress? Every cry, every sound the baby made could mean death if the wrong person heard. His mother had to muffle his sounds, keep him quiet during the day, and live in constant fear of discovery. She couldn't let him outside, couldn't show him to friends, couldn't even celebrate his milestones. But her faith in God was stronger than her fear of Pharaoh. She believed that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had a plan for her precious son. As the baby grew, hiding him became impossible. He was getting bigger, stronger, and louder. His cries were harder to muffle, and his movements more difficult to contain. His mother knew she had to make the hardest choice any parent could face. She had to let him go and trust God completely with his life. Her faith didn't waver. Instead, it led her to create a bold plan that would change the course of history. Sometimes the greatest act of love means letting go and trusting God with what matters most to us. Moses' mother made a waterproof basket from reeds and covered it with tar to keep water out. She placed her baby inside with tender care, kissing him one last time before setting the basket among the reeds by the river's edge. His sister Miriam watched from a distance to see what would happen. God's timing was perfect. Exodus chapter 2 verses 5-6 describes the moment that changed everything. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." The princess's heart melted when she heard the baby crying. Even though she knew this was a Hebrew child, the very people her father wanted destroyed, she felt love instead of hatred. God had touched her heart with compassion. This Egyptian princess, who could have had any luxury she wanted, suddenly wanted nothing more than to save this helpless baby. She could have obeyed her father's cruel law, but instead she chose mercy. Miriam seized the moment with wisdom beyond her years. She approached the princess and asked if she wanted her to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. When the princess agreed, Miriam ran to get her own mother. Exodus chapter 2 verse 9 shows God's amazing plan. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, "Take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages." Moses' mother was not only reunited with her son, but was actually paid by Pharaoh's household to care for him. The very king who wanted Hebrew babies dead was now unknowingly protecting and providing for the future deliverer of God's people. When Moses was old enough to leave his mother's care, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess gave him an Egyptian name that meant drawn out of water, remembering how she had found him floating in the Nile. Acts chapter 7 verse 22 tells us about his education. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deeds, who received the finest education money could buy, studying mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and military strategy. The boy who should have died in the Nile was now learning from Egypt's greatest teachers. Moses lived in luxury that most people could never imagine. He wore fine clothes made from the softest linen, ate the best food prepared by royal chefs, and had servants waiting on his every need. The palace halls echoed with his footsteps as he walked among Egypt's most powerful people. He learned Egyptian customs, spoke their language perfectly, and understood how their government worked. He attended royal ceremonies, watched political meetings, and saw how a kingdom was ruled. Everything about his upbringing prepared him to be a leader, though he didn't yet know God's purpose for his life. Yet even surrounded by Egyptian luxury, Moses never forgot he was Hebrew. His early years with his birth mother had planted seeds of identity deep in his heart. She had told him stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. She had taught him about the one true God who made promises to their ancestors. He knew that the slaves building Egypt's cities were his own people, his own flesh and blood. This knowledge created a tension in his heart that grew stronger every day. God was preparing Moses for leadership in ways that seemed impossible, by raising him in the very house of Israel's oppressor. As Moses grew into manhood, his heart became troubled by what he saw around him. The comfort of palace life couldn't silence the cries of his suffering people outside the royal walls. One day, he made a decision that would change his life forever. He went out to see how his Hebrew brothers were really living. Exodus chapter 2 verse 11 records this turning point. And it came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren, and looked on their burdens. What Moses saw that day broke his heart into pieces. These weren't just slaves working in fields. They were his people, his family, his flesh and blood. He watched Hebrew men stumble under heavy loads of bricks and stones, while Egyptian taskmasters beat them without mercy. He saw the sweat pouring down their faces, the blood on their backs, and the tears in their eyes. These were people who shared his heritage, who worshipped the same God his mother had taught him about. The fine clothes on his back suddenly felt wrong. The rich food in his stomach turned sour. How could he live in such comfort while his people suffered in chains? This wasn't just curiosity about his background, it was a complete spiritual awakening. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24 explains what happened in Moses' heart during this time. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He made a choice that cost him everything the world could offer, but aligned him perfectly with God's purpose. The comfortable prince was becoming the compassionate deliverer, even though he didn't fully understand what God was preparing him for. Sometimes God opens our eyes to see pain we've been blind to, not to discourage us, but to prepare us for the work He's calling us to do. The next day, Moses returned to the work sites to watch his people. That's when he witnessed something that ignited his anger like fire. An Egyptian taskmaster was brutally beating a Hebrew worker, and Moses couldn't stand it anymore. His sense of justice exploded. Exodus chapter 2 verse 12 tells us what happened next. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Moses thought no one had seen what he did, but he was wrong. The next day, when he tried to stop two Hebrews from fighting each other, one of them challenged him with these shocking words from Exodus chapter 2 verse 14. Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killedst the Egyptian? Moses realized his secret was out, and cold fear gripped his heart. If the Hebrew people knew what he had done, how long before the Egyptians found out too? Word traveled fast in Egypt. When Pharaoh heard that Moses had killed an Egyptian, he was absolutely furious. The man he had raised in his own palace, treated like a son, and given every advantage, had turned against him. This felt like the worst kind of betrayal. Exodus chapter 2 verse 15 describes Moses' desperate situation. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian. The prince became a fugitive overnight. Everything he had known, the palace, the power, the privilege, the security, was gone forever. Moses had to run for his life into the harsh wilderness, not knowing that God was leading him exactly where he needed to be for the next phase of his preparation. Tired, thirsty, and probably wondering what would become of his life, Moses finally reached the land of Midian and sat down by a well to rest. Soon, 7 sisters came to draw water for their father's sheep, but some rough shepherds tried to drive them away from the well. Moses stood up for these women, just like he had tried to defend his Hebrew brother back in Egypt. Exodus chapter 2 verse 17 shows his character. And the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them, and watered their flock, even as a fugitive. Moses couldn't help but protect those who were being treated unfairly. The grateful sisters ran home and told their father Reuel about the Egyptian stranger who had helped them at the well. When Reuel heard the story of this man's kindness to his daughters, he was impressed and wanted to meet him. Exodus chapter 2 verse 20 shows his generous response. And he said unto his daughters, And where is he? Why is it that ye have left the man? O call him, that he may eat bread. This priest of Midian welcomed the runaway prince and gave him work tending sheep in the wilderness. It was a dramatic change. From Egyptian palaces to desert pastures, from royal robes to shepherd's clothes, from commanding servants to following sheep around rocky hills, Moses found peace and purpose in this simple life. He married one of Reuel's daughters, a woman named Zipporah, and they built a loving home together. When their first son was born, Exodus chapter 2, verse 22 records the meaningful name Moses chose, and she bare him a son. And he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. Moses was building a new life in Midian, learning patience by caring for sheep. But the name he chose for his son revealed the truth. He still felt like an outsider everywhere he went. He had left Egypt behind, but he hadn't yet found his true home or purpose. Little did he know that God was using these quiet years in the wilderness to teach him everything he would need for the greatest mission any man had ever received. 40 years had passed since Moses fled Egypt. He was now 80 years old, content with his quiet life as a shepherd in Midian. One ordinary day, while leading his father-in-law's flock to find pasture, something extraordinary happened. Moses took the sheep to the far side of the desert, near a mountain called Horeb. As he walked among the rocks and thorns, searching for grass, a strange sight caught his attention. There, in the middle of nowhere, a bush was on fire. But this wasn't like any fire Moses had ever seen. Exodus chapter 3 verse 2 describes what made this so amazing. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. The flames danced and flickered, but the green leaves didn't turn black. The branches didn't crumble to ash. The bush kept burning without being destroyed. Moses stopped walking and stared. In 40 years of desert life, he had seen many fires, but nothing like this. His curiosity got the better of him. Exodus chapter 3 verse 3 tells us what he decided to do. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt. He left his sheep and walked toward the impossible fire. As his sandals crunched on the rocky ground, he had no idea he was about to meet the God of the universe face to face. As Moses drew closer to the burning bush, a voice called out from the flames. It wasn't the crackling sound of fire, it was the voice of the living God. Exodus chapter 3. Verse 4 records this holy moment. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. The shepherd, who thought he was just investigating a strange fire, was now standing in the presence of the Almighty. God's next words made Moses' knees shake with fear and wonder. Exodus chapter 3 verse 5 shows the holiness of this moment. And he said, Draw not nigh hither, put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Moses quickly kicked off his sandals, feeling the warm desert sand between his toes. The ground looked the same as everywhere else, but God's presence made it sacred. Then God identified himself in words that made Moses hide his face. Moreover, he said, I am the God of thy father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. But Moses needed to know more about who was speaking to him. When God told him to go rescue the Israelites from Egypt, Moses asked a question that would change everything. Exodus chapter 3 verse 13 records his request. And Moses said unto God, Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, The God of your fathers hath sent me unto you. And they shall say to me, What is his name? What shall I say unto them? God's answer revealed his eternal nature. And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. This name meant God exists by his own power, depends on no one, and never changes. The great I am was calling Moses to the impossible. When God finished explaining the mission to rescue Israel from Egypt, Moses felt overwhelmed. The man who once lived in Pharaoh's palace now doubted he could face him again. Moses began making excuses, hoping God would choose someone else. His first excuse came in Exodus chapter 4, verse 1. And Moses answered and said, But behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, The Lord hath not appeared unto thee. Moses worried the Israelites wouldn't trust him or believe his story about the burning bush. God patiently answered Moses' doubt by giving him 3 miraculous signs. First, he told Moses to throw his shepherd's staff on the ground. When Moses obeyed, the wooden rod became a living snake that made him jump back in fear. Then God told him to grab the snake by the tail, and it became a staff again. Next, God told Moses to put his hand inside his robe. When he pulled it out, his hand was white with leprosy. When he put it back and pulled it out again, his hand was perfectly healthy. But Moses still wasn't convinced. He tried another excuse in Exodus chapter 4, verse 10. And Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech, and of a slow tongue. Moses claimed he wasn't a good speaker and couldn't possibly represent God before Pharaoh. God's response showed his power over human weakness. And the Lord said unto him, Who hath made man's mouth? Or who maketh the dumb or deaf or the seeing or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with thy mouth, and teach thee what thou shalt say. Moses was running out of excuses, but he tried one more desperate plea. Exodus chapter 4, verse 13 records his final attempt to escape God's calling. And he said, O my Lord, send, I pray thee, by the hand of him whom thou wilt send. Moses was basically saying, Please send someone else instead of me. This made God angry, but he still showed mercy by providing Moses with help. God's anger burned against Moses for his continued reluctance, but divine mercy still provided a solution. Exodus chapter 4, verses 14 to 15 reveal God's plan. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, Is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know that he can speak well. And also, behold, he cometh forth to meet thee, and when he seeth thee, he will be glad in his heart. And thou shalt speak unto him, and put words in his mouth, and I will be with thy mouth, and with his mouth, and will teach you what ye shall do. Aaron was Moses' older brother, the one who had watched over him as a baby floating in the Nile. God had been preparing Aaron for this moment just as he had been preparing Moses. While Moses learned leadership in Pharaoh's palace and patience in the wilderness, Aaron had remained with the Hebrew people, experiencing their suffering firsthand. He knew their pain, spoke their language, and understood their deepest longings for freedom. God explained exactly how this partnership would work. Exodus chapter 4 verse 16 shows the arrangement. And he shall be thy spokesman unto the people, and he shall be, even he shall be to thee instead of a mouth, and thou shalt be to him instead of God. Moses would receive God's messages, give them to Aaron, and Aaron would speak them to the people and to Pharaoh. It was the perfect plan. Moses had the authority and revelation from God, while Aaron had the speaking skills and connection with the people. The timing was miraculous. Even as God was speaking to Moses at the burning bush, Aaron was already traveling through the desert to find his brother. God had put it in Aaron's heart to leave his home and go searching for Moses in the wilderness. When the two brothers met after 40 years apart, their reunion was filled with joy and purpose. Moses told Aaron everything that had happened at the burning bush, and Aaron believed every word. The team that would challenge the mightiest empire on earth was now complete. After saying goodbye to his father-in-law Jethro and receiving permission to leave, Moses packed his few belongings and started the journey back to Egypt. He took his wife Zipporah and his sons, along with the miraculous staff that God had given him. This wasn't the same scared fugitive who had fled Egypt 40 years earlier. Moses now carried the authority of the great I Am and supernatural signs that would prove his divine commission. The reunion with Aaron was emotional and powerful. When Moses told his brother about the burning bush, the mission to rescue Israel, and the miraculous signs God had given him, Aaron's heart filled with excitement and faith. Together, they traveled to Egypt and immediately began gathering the Hebrew elders. These were the leaders of the 12 tribes who had maintained hope during 4 centuries of slavery. Exodus chapter 4. Verse 30 describes what happened when Moses and Aaron met with the people. And Aaron spake all the words which the Lord had spoken unto Moses, and did the signs in the sight of the people. Moses threw down his staff, and it became a serpent. He put his hand in his robe, and it came out leprous, then became healthy again. He poured water from the river on dry ground, and it turned to blood. The people watched in amazement as the impossible happened before their eyes. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Exodus chapter 4 verse 31 records the people's reaction, and the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel, and that he had looked upon their affliction, then they bowed their heads and worshipped. After 400 years of waiting, crying and suffering, the Hebrew people finally had proof that God remembered them. Their deliverer had come at last, armed with miraculous power and divine authority to set them free. With the Hebrew people behind them, Moses and Aaron walked boldly into Pharaoh's palace. This was the same palace where Moses had grown up, but now he entered as God's messenger rather than Egypt's prince. The brothers approached the throne of the most powerful ruler in the world with a simple but shocking demand. Exodus chapter 5, verse 1 records their words. And afterward Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Let my people go, that they may hold a feast unto me in the wilderness. Pharaoh's response revealed his proud and rebellious heart. He didn't just refuse. He mocked the very idea that there was a God greater than himself. Exodus chapter 5 verse 2 shows his arrogance. And Pharaoh said, Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go. This wasn't just a political decision, it was a spiritual declaration of war against the God of Israel. Moses and Aaron tried again, explaining that their God had met with them and commanded them to make this request. But Pharaoh accused them of making the Hebrew people lazy and distracting them from their work. He dismissed them from his presence, thinking he had ended the matter. But God had given Moses and Aaron supernatural signs for exactly this kind of resistance. When Pharaoh demanded proof of their divine authority, Moses and Aaron were ready. Exodus chapter 7 verse 10 describes the miraculous demonstration. And Moses and Aaron went in unto Pharaoh, and they did so as the Lord had commanded. And Aaron cast down his rod before Pharaoh and before his servants, and it became a serpent. The wooden staff transformed into a living snake right there in the throne room, proving that the God of Israel had power over creation itself. But Pharaoh wasn't impressed. He called for his own wise men, sorcerers, and magicians to match this miracle. Exodus chapter 7 verse 11 tells us what happened next. Then Pharaoh also called the wise men and the sorcerers, now the magicians of Egypt. They also did in like manner with their enchantments. Each magician threw down his rod, and they also became serpents. The throne room was suddenly full of snakes slithering across the marble floor. However, God's power proved superior. Exodus chapter 7 verse 12 reveals the outcome. For they cast down every man his rod, and they became serpents, but Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods, one by one. Aaron's serpent devoured all the magician's serpents, leaving only one snake on the floor. When it transformed back into Moses' staff, the message was clear. The God of Israel was more powerful than all of Egypt's gods combined. But Pharaoh's heart remained stubborn, just as God had predicted. Instead of being humbled by God's supernatural demonstration, Pharaoh became more defiant and cruel. He decided to punish the Hebrew people for even asking to leave Egypt. His revenge was swift and harsh. Exodus chapter 5 verses 6-7 record his cruel new orders. And Pharaoh commanded the same day the taskmasters of the people and their officers, saying, "You shall no more give the people straw to make brick. As heretofore, let them go and gather straw for themselves." This was devastating news for the Hebrew slaves. Making bricks required straw to hold the clay together and make it strong. Before this, the Egyptians provided the straw, and the Hebrews focused on making their daily quota of bricks. Now they had to find their own straw while still producing the same number of bricks each day. It was an impossible task designed to break their spirits and exhaust their bodies. The Hebrew foreman tried desperately to explain the situation to their Egyptian taskmasters, but there was no mercy. When they couldn't meet their brick quotas, they were beaten severely. Exodus chapter 5 verse 14 describes their suffering. And the officers of the children of Israel, which Pharaoh's taskmasters had set over them, were beaten and demanded, "Wherefore have ye not fulfilled your task in making brick both yesterday and today, as heretofore?" These Hebrew foremen were caught in the middle, beaten by the Egyptians for not meeting impossible quotas, and blamed by their own people for the increased suffering. In desperation, they went directly to Pharaoh to ask for mercy. But the king's heart had grown even harder. He accused them of being lazy and wanting to escape work by going to worship their God in the wilderness. The situation was worse than it had been before Moses arrived. The Hebrew people, who had initially rejoiced at Moses' signs and wonders, now turned against him in anger and frustration. Exodus chapter 5 verse 21 records their bitter complaint. "And they said unto them, The Lord look upon you and judge, because ye have made our savor to be abhorred in the eyes of Pharaoh, and in the eyes of his servants, to put a sword in their hand to slay us." The people who had worshipped God just days before were now blaming Moses for making their lives unbearable, watching his people suffer more than ever before. Moses felt confused and heartbroken. This wasn't what he had expected when God called him at the burning bush. He thought the miraculous signs would convince Pharaoh immediately that the Hebrew people would be free within days, not facing worse oppression than before. The weight of their increased suffering pressed down on his heart like a heavy stone. Moses did what any honest person would do when God's plan seemed to be failing. He went directly to God with his questions and complaints. Exodus chapter 5 verse 22 shows his raw honesty. "And Moses returned unto the Lord and said, Lord, wherefore hast thou so evil entreated this people? Why is it that thou hast sent me?" These weren't the words of a man trying to sound spiritual. They were the desperate cries of someone who couldn't understand why things were getting worse instead of better. Moses continued pouring out his heart to God, expressing the confusion that was tearing him apart. Exodus chapter 5 verse 23 reveals the depth of his frustration. "For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in thy name, he hath done evil to this people. Neither hast thou delivered thy people at all." Moses had obeyed God's command, performed the miraculous signs, and delivered the message exactly as instructed. But instead of freedom, the Hebrew people faced crueler slavery than ever before. God listened patiently to Moses' complaints and questions. He didn't rebuke Moses for his honesty or punish him for expressing doubt. Instead, God began to reveal more of his plan and character. Exodus chapter 6 verse 1 contains God's reassuring response. "Then the Lord said unto Moses, Now shalt thou see what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand shall he let them go, and with a strong hand shall he drive them out of his land." God was preparing Moses for something much bigger than a simple release from slavery. He was about to demonstrate his power in ways that would be remembered forever. God reminded Moses of his covenant promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. and revealed that he had allowed this increased suffering for a purpose. The worse conditions became, the more obvious God's miraculous intervention would be when it finally came. Pharaoh's hardened heart wasn't defeating God's plan, it was setting the stage for an even greater display of divine power that would leave no doubt about who the true God really was. God was ready to show Pharaoh and all Egypt that he alone was the true God. The first demonstration of his power would strike. At the heart of Egyptian life, the mighty Nile River that they worshipped as a god. Early one morning, Moses and Aaron went to the riverbank where Pharaoh came to perform his daily religious rituals. As the king approached the water's edge, Moses delivered God's message, with Aaron speaking the words clearly. When Pharaoh refused to listen, Aaron lifted the staff high above his head and struck the waters of the Nile. Exodus chapter 7. Verse 20 describes what happened next. And Moses and Aaron did so, as the Lord commanded. And he lifted up the rod, and smote the waters that were in the river, in the sight of Pharaoh, and in the sight of his servants. And all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. The sacred Nile River, which Egyptians believed was the source of all life, became a river of death. The transformation was complete and horrifying. Exodus chapter 7 verse 21 shows the full extent of this miracle. And the fish that was in the river died, and the river stank, and the Egyptians could not drink of the waters of the river. And there was blood throughout all the land of Egypt, every fish floating belly up on the surface, the terrible smell filling the air. And worst of all, no clean water to drink anywhere in the entire nation. But Pharaoh's magicians managed to duplicate this miracle with their secret arts, turning small amounts of water to blood as well. This gave Pharaoh an excuse to dismiss God's power as nothing special. His heart remained hard, and he walked back to his palace, leaving his people to dig desperately along the riverbanks for clean water. For 7 long days, Egypt suffered without their precious Nile, but their king refused to humble himself before the God of Israel. 7 days passed, and Pharaoh still wouldn't let the Hebrew people go. So God sent Moses and Aaron back to him with another warning. If he continued to refuse God's command, something even more disgusting would cover his entire kingdom. When Pharaoh dismissed their message again, Aaron stretched out his hand over all the waters of Egypt, the streams, rivers, ponds, and pools that remained after the blood plague. Suddenly, frogs began emerging from every source of water in Egypt. But these weren't just a few frogs hopping around. This was an invasion beyond imagination. Exodus chapter 8 verse 3 describes the overwhelming scene. And the river shall bring forth frogs abundantly, which shall go up and come into thine house, and into thy bedchamber, and upon thy bed, and into the house of thy servants, and upon thy people, and into thine ovens, and into thy kneading troughs. Millions of slimy, croaking frogs filled every space in Egypt. They were everywhere, in beds, in food, in clothing, covering the floors so thick you couldn't walk without stepping on them. The constant croaking was deafening, and the smell was unbearable. Even Pharaoh's palace wasn't spared. Frogs covered his throne, filled his private chambers, and made royal life miserable. Finally, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and begged them to pray for the frogs to be removed. Promising to let the people go worship their God, Moses prayed, and God removed every frog from Egypt except those in the river. But as soon as Pharaoh could breathe freely again, he broke his promise and refused to release the Hebrews. So God sent the 3rd plague without warning. Aaron struck the dust of the earth with his staff, and every speck of dust throughout Egypt became gnats. Exodus chapter 8 verse 17 shows the result, and they did so. For Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod, and smote the dust of the earth, and it became lice in man and in beast. All the dust of the land became lice throughout all the land of Egypt. When Pharaoh's magicians tried to create gnats with their secret arts, they failed completely. This was beyond their power, and they had to admit it. Exodus chapter 8 verse 19 records their confession. Then the magicians said unto Pharaoh, This is the finger of God, but Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he hearkened not unto them. Even his own wise men recognized God's superior power, but Pharaoh refused to listen. The fourth plague came next, swarms of flies so thick they covered everything and everyone in Egypt. But this time, God made a clear distinction. Exodus chapter 8 verse 22 reveals God's protection for his people. And I will sever in that day the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there. To the end thou mayest know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. While Egypt suffocated under clouds of flies, the Hebrew people in Goshen enjoyed clear air and peace. God's patience with Pharaoh was running out, and the plagues were becoming more severe. The fifth plague struck Egypt's economy at its foundation, their livestock. Moses delivered God's warning that a terrible disease would kill all the Egyptian cattle, horses, donkeys, camels, oxen, and sheep. But again, God protected the Hebrew people's animals in the land of Goshen. The next day, the plague hit exactly as God had promised. Exodus chapter 9 verse 6 describes the devastation. And the Lord did that thing on the morrow, and all the cattle of Egypt died, but of the cattle of the children of Israel died not one. Pharaoh sent messengers to check on the Hebrew livestock, and they reported back that not a single animal belonging to God's people had died. This should have convinced Pharaoh of God's power and protection, but his heart remained stubborn. The sixth plague came without warning and affected people directly for the first time. God told Moses and Aaron to take handfuls of ashes from a furnace and throw them into the air while Pharaoh watched. Exodus chapter 9 verse 10 shows what happened. And they took ashes of the furnace and stood before Pharaoh, and Moses sprinkled it up toward heaven. And it became a boil breaking forth with blains upon man and upon beast. Painful boils erupted all over the bodies of every Egyptian person and animal. The boils were so severe that Pharaoh's magicians couldn't even stand before Moses anymore. They were covered with the same painful sores as everyone else in Egypt. But once again, the Hebrew people were spared from this plague. Only the Egyptians suffered while God's chosen people remained healthy and unharmed. Then came the seventh plague, the most destructive storm Egypt had ever seen. God warned Pharaoh through Moses that hail would fall unlike anything Egypt had experienced before or would experience again. Those Egyptians who feared God's word brought their servants and cattle into shelter. But those who ignored the warning left them in the fields. Exodus chapter 9. Verse 23 describes the terrifying storm. And Moses stretched forth his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and the fire ran along upon the ground. And the Lord rained hail upon the land of Egypt. This wasn't ordinary hail. It was mixed with fire, creating a supernatural storm that destroyed everything in its path. The hail was so large and the lightning so fierce that it killed every person and animal caught outside, shattered every tree, and destroyed all the crops growing in the fields. But in the land of Goshen, where God's people lived, not a single hailstone fell. Exodus chapter 9 verse 26 emphasizes this miracle. Only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were, was there no hail. While Egypt lay in ruins from the devastating storm, the Hebrew people enjoyed perfect weather and safety. After the hail destroyed most of Egypt's crops, Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and admitted he had sinned. He begged them to pray for the storm to stop, promising once again to let the Hebrew people go. Moses prayed, and God stopped the hail immediately. But as soon as the danger passed, Pharaoh changed his mind and refused to keep his promise. So God prepared the eighth plague, an army of locusts that would eat everything the hail had left behind. Moses warned Pharaoh that these locusts would cover the ground so completely that no one would be able to see the earth beneath them. They would eat every plant, every tree, and every green thing remaining after the hailstorm. Even Pharaoh's own servants begged him to listen to Moses this time. Exodus chapter 10 verse 7 records their desperate plea. And Pharaoh's servants said unto him, How long shall this man be a snare unto us? Let the men go, that they may serve the Lord their God. Knowest thou not yet that Egypt is destroyed? They could see that their nation was being ruined, but Pharaoh's pride was stronger than his wisdom. When Moses stretched out his hand over Egypt, God sent an east wind that blew all day and all night. By morning, the wind had brought clouds of locusts unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Exodus chapter 10 verse 14 describes the invasion. And the locusts went up over all the land of Egypt, and rested in all the coasts of Egypt. Very grievous were they. Before them there were no such locusts as they, neither after them shall be such. The sky turned black with millions of hungry insects. The locusts devoured everything green that remained in Egypt. They ate every herb, every fruit on the trees, and every blade of grass that had survived the hail. When they finished, Egypt looked like a barren desert. There was nothing left for people or animals to eat. Pharaoh quickly called Moses and Aaron, confessed his sin, and begged for forgiveness. But when God removed the locusts with a strong west wind, Pharaoh hardened his heart once more. The 9th plague brought something that terrified the Egyptians more than anything else: total darkness. Without any warning, Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and supernatural darkness covered the entire land of Egypt. This wasn't ordinary nighttime darkness. It was so thick you could feel it. Exodus chapter 10 verse 22 describes this terrifying experience. And Moses stretched forth his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days. For 3 full days and nights, the darkness was so complete that people couldn't see their own hands in front of their faces. They couldn't work, couldn't travel, couldn't even move around their own houses safely. Egypt, which worshipped the sun god Ra, was cut off from all light. But in the Hebrew homes in Goshen, there was perfect light. While their Egyptian neighbors sat in terrifying darkness, God's people enjoyed normal daylight and continued their daily activities. After the darkness ended, Pharaoh called Moses one final time. He was willing to let the Hebrew people go worship their God, but he wanted to keep all their livestock in Egypt. Moses refused this compromise, explaining that they needed their animals for sacrifices. This made Pharaoh explode with anger, and he ordered Moses never to come before him again. Moses agreed that he would never see Pharaoh's face again, but first he had to deliver one last message, the most terrible warning of all. God was about to send a plague so devastating that it would finally break Pharaoh's stubborn heart. Exodus chapter 11. Verse 4 contains Moses' solemn announcement. And Moses said, "Thus saith the Lord, about midnight will I go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sitteth upon his throne, even unto the firstborn of the maidservant that is behind the mill, and all the firstborn of beasts." This wasn't a natural disaster like the previous plagues. This was the angel of death himself passing through Egypt. Every firstborn son would die in one night, from the crown prince in the palace to the poorest servant's child. Every firstborn animal would also die. The grief would be so great that there would be crying in every house throughout Egypt. But Moses also delivered hope for those who would obey God's instructions. The Hebrew people would be completely protected if they followed God's specific commands about what to do that night. God was giving them a way to escape the angel of death through the blood of a sacrificed lamb. Moses explained that this would be the final plague. After this night of death, Pharaoh would not only let the Hebrew people go, he would actually drive them out of Egypt and beg them to leave quickly. The 400 years of slavery were about to end in one terrible night that would be remembered forever. Exodus chapter 11 verse 8 records Moses' final words to Pharaoh, "And all these thy servants shall come down unto me, and bow down themselves unto me, saying, Get thee out, and all the people that follow thee, and after that I will go out." And he went out from Pharaoh in a great anger. God gave Moses and Aaron detailed instructions for a new ceremony that would save the Hebrew people from the angel of death. This would become the most important celebration in Israel's history, the Passover. Each family had to select a perfect lamb on the 10th day of the month and care for it until the 14th day. On the evening of the 14th day, they were to kill the lamb at twilight and do something that seemed strange but was absolutely essential for their protection. Exodus chapter 12 verse 7 contains God's specific command, "And they shall take of the blood, and strike it on the 2 side posts and on the upper doorpost of the houses, wherein they shall eat it." The blood had to mark the doorway of every Hebrew home. The lamb had to be roasted whole and eaten that same night with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They couldn't break any of the lamb's bones, and they couldn't leave any of the meat until morning. Most importantly, they had to eat this meal dressed and ready to travel quickly, with their shoes on their feet, their walking sticks in their hands, and their clothes tucked up for walking. God explained why the blood on the doorways was so crucial. Exodus chapter 12 verse 13 reveals the protection it would provide. "And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where ye are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you, when I smite the land of Egypt." The angel of death would pass over every house marked with the lamb's blood. This wasn't just a one-time event. God commanded that this ceremony be repeated every year forever as a memorial of their deliverance from Egypt. Exodus chapter 12 verse 14 establishes this permanent celebration. "And this day shall be unto you for a memorial, and ye shall keep it a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. Ye shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever." The Hebrew people listened carefully to these instructions and prepared exactly as God commanded. They selected their lambs, marked their doorways with blood, and gathered in their homes dressed for travel. Children asked their parents what all this meant, and the parents explained how God was rescuing them from slavery. That night, every Hebrew family waited behind doors marked with blood, trusting in God's promise of protection. As midnight approached, an eerie silence fell over Egypt. Then, exactly at the stroke of 12, the angel of death began moving through the land. In every Egyptian home without blood on the doorway, the firstborn son suddenly died. From Pharaoh's palace to the poorest peasant's hut, from the highest official to the lowliest prisoner, death visited every family that wasn't protected by the lamb's blood. Exodus chapter 12. Verse 30 describes the horror that filled Egypt that night. "And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt. For there was not a house where there was not one dead. The sound of weeping and wailing echoed from every street, every neighborhood, every corner of the nation. Egypt had never experienced such widespread grief and terror. Pharaoh's own firstborn son, the prince who would have inherited the throne, died in the palace. The man who had claimed not to know the Lord was now experiencing his judgment firsthand. In one night, God had destroyed Egypt's future leaders, broken their families, and shattered their pride. The king who had refused to humble himself before God was now desperate and terrified. In the middle of the night, Pharaoh sent messengers running through the streets to find Moses and Aaron. He couldn't wait until morning. This had to stop immediately. Exodus chapter 12 verse 31 records his frantic message, "And he called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, Rise up and get you forth from among my people, both ye and the children of Israel, and go serve the Lord as ye have said." The stubborn king was now begging the Hebrew people to leave, but Pharaoh didn't stop there. His desperation grew even greater as the hours passed and the death count rose. Exodus chapter 12 verse 32 shows how completely his attitude had changed. "Also take your flocks and your herds, as ye have said, and be gone, and bless me also." The man who had once wanted to keep their livestock was now insisting they take everything and leave immediately. He even asked Moses to bless him, recognizing at last that the God of Israel was truly the most powerful God. The Egyptian people were just as desperate as their king. They had lost sons, brothers, and grandsons in one terrible night. They blamed themselves for keeping the Hebrew people in slavery and wanted them gone before more judgment fell. Exodus chapter 12, verse 33 describes their panic, and the Egyptians were urgent upon the people that they might send them out of the land in haste. For they said, "We be all dead men." They literally pushed the Hebrew people out of their neighborhoods, afraid that everyone in Egypt would die if the Israelites stayed any longer. After 400 years of slavery, the moment of freedom had finally come. The Hebrew people didn't have time to let their bread rise, so they wrapped the raw dough in their clothes and carried it on their shoulders. They had been ready for this moment since the Passover meal began, dressed for travel, with their belongings packed and their walking sticks in hand. The numbers were staggering. Exodus chapter 12, verse 37 gives us the count. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot that were men, beside children. This was just the count of adult men, when you included women, children, and elderly people. The total population was probably around 2 million people leaving Egypt at the same time. But it wasn't just Hebrew people making this journey. Many Egyptians and people from other nations joined them, having seen God's mighty power and wanting to worship the true God. Exodus chapter 12, verse 38 mentions this mixed multitude. And a mixed multitude went up also with them, and flocks and herds, even very much cattle. The Exodus included people from many backgrounds, all united in following the God who had defeated Egypt's gods. The Egyptian people, still terrified from the night of death, showered the departing Hebrew people with gifts. They gave them silver, gold, jewelry, and expensive clothing, partly out of guilt for enslaving them, and partly out of fear that more plagues would come if they didn't treat God's people generously. Exodus chapter 12, verse 36 describes this amazing reversal. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they lent unto them such things as they required. And they spoiled the Egyptians. The great procession moved slowly out of Egypt, with families walking together, children riding on donkeys, and huge flocks of sheep and goats spreading across the landscape. Carts loaded with household goods creaked along dusty roads, and the sound of 2 million people talking, singing, and praising God filled the air. After centuries of making bricks for Egyptian cities, they were finally free to go worship their God in the wilderness. As they walked away from the only land most of them had ever known, many looked back at the Egyptian cities, growing smaller behind them. But there was no sadness in their hearts, only joy, excitement, and wonder at what God had done. The impossible had happened. The slaves had become free people, and the God of their ancestors had proven his faithfulness to every promise he had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. 3 days into their journey from Egypt, the Hebrew people found themselves trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's approaching army. God had led them by a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night to this exact spot. It seemed like a dead end, but God had planned this moment to show his power one final time. The people were terrified when they saw dust clouds on the horizon. Pharaoh had changed his mind again and was coming after them with his entire army. Moses stood before 2 million panicking people and delivered God's message of hope. Exodus chapter 14, verse 13 records his confident words. And Moses said unto the people, "Fear ye not, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show to you today. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again no more forever." Moses knew that God had not brought them this far just to let them die at the water's edge. As the Egyptian chariots drew closer, God told Moses to stretch his hand over the sea. When Moses obeyed, something incredible began to happen. Exodus chapter 14, verse 21 describes the miracle. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. And the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. All night long, a powerful wind pushed the water back until there was a dry path straight across the sea floor. But this wasn't just any dry path. God had created walls of water on both sides that stood up like giant liquid cliffs. The Hebrew people walked across the seabed with walls of water towering above them on the right and left. Exodus chapter 14 verse 22 captures this amazing sight. And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left hand. 2 million people with all their animals and belongings crossed safely to the other side on completely dry ground. When the Egyptian army reached the Red Sea, they saw the walls of water and the dry path where the Hebrew people had crossed. Instead of being amazed by this obvious miracle from God, Pharaoh's soldiers charged forward in pursuit. Their horses' hooves thundered on the sea floor as 600 chariots raced between the towering walls of water. But God was fighting for Israel that day. Exodus chapter 14 verse 24 shows how he confused the Egyptian army. And it came to pass that in the morning watch the Lord looked unto the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and of the cloud, and troubled the host of the Egyptians, and took off their chariot wheels, that they drave them heavily, so that the Egyptians said, Let us flee from the face of Israel. For the Lord fighteth for them against the Egyptians. The Egyptian soldiers suddenly realized they had made a terrible mistake. Their chariot wheels were falling off, their horses were stumbling, and they were trapped between walls of water with nowhere to escape. They tried to turn around and flee, but it was too late. God told Moses to stretch his hand over the sea again, and the waters came crashing back together. Exodus chapter 14, verse 28 describes the complete destruction of Egypt's army, and the waters returned, and covered the chariots and the horsemen, and all the host of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. There remained not so much as one of them. Every single Egyptian soldier who had entered the sea was drowned. Pharaoh's mighty army, which had struck fear into the hearts of nations, was completely destroyed in minutes. When the Hebrew people saw their enemies' bodies washed up on the shore, they knew God had given them total victory. They burst into songs of praise and thanksgiving. Exodus chapter 15, verse 1, records the beginning of Moses' victory song. Then sang Moses and the children of Israel this song unto the Lord, and spake, saying, I will sing unto the Lord, for he hath triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea. The slaves, who had once feared Pharaoh's chariots, now sang about God's power over Egypt's horses and riders. Moses' sister Miriam led the women in a celebration dance, playing tambourines and singing praises to God. The fear and panic from the night before had turned into pure joy and worship. They finally understood that they were truly free, not just from slavery, but from any threat Egypt could ever pose again. After celebrating their victory at the Red Sea, the Hebrew people continued their journey into the wilderness of Shur. But the joy of freedom soon turned to worry about basic survival needs. 3 days of walking brought them to a place called Marah, where they found water but couldn't drink it because it was bitter and made them sick. The people started complaining to Moses about the bitter water, forgetting how God had just saved them from Pharaoh's army. God showed Moses a specific tree and told him to throw it into the water. When Moses obeyed, the bitter water became sweet and good to drink. This was their first lesson that God would provide for all their needs in the wilderness. 6 weeks later, their food supplies from Egypt ran out completely. The people began complaining again, this time wishing they had never left slavery. They told Moses they would rather have died in Egypt, where they had plenty of bread and meat to eat. But God heard their complaints and promised to rain bread from heaven for them every single day. The next morning, the Hebrew people woke up to find something strange covering the ground around their camp. Exodus chapter 16, verse 14, describes what they saw. And when the dew that lay was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness there lay a small round thing, as small as the hoarfrost on the ground. They had never seen anything like these small, white flakes that tasted like honey wafers. Moses explained that this was bread from God, and they were to gather exactly what they needed for each day. about 2 quarts per person. If they tried to keep extra for the next day, it would spoil and become full of worms. But on Friday, they were to gather twice as much because God would not send manna on the Sabbath day. Exodus chapter 16 verse 31 tells us what they called this heavenly food, and the house of Israel called the name thereof manna. For they said, "What is it?" For they wist not what it was. When the people complained about lack of water at a place called Rephidim, God told Moses to strike a rock with his staff. Water gushed out of the solid rock, providing enough for 2 million people and all their animals to drink. Moses named that place Massah and Meribah because the people tested God and argued with him there. But God patiently provided for their needs despite their complaints and doubts. While the Hebrew people were camped at Rephidim, a fierce tribe called the Amalekites came and attacked them without any warning or reason. These desert warriors were descendants of Esau and had been enemies of God's people for generations. They chose to fight against the nation that had just witnessed God's mighty miracles. Showing their complete lack of respect for the Lord, Moses chose a young man named Joshua to lead the Hebrew soldiers in battle against the Amalekites. This was Joshua's first military command, and it would be the beginning of his rise as Israel's greatest warrior. Moses told Joshua to select fighting men and prepare for battle the next day, while Moses himself would stand on a hilltop overlooking the battlefield. The battle strategy was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Exodus chapter 17 verse 11 describes how the fight was won. "And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed." The outcome of the battle depended entirely on whether Moses kept his hands raised toward heaven, showing that victory came from God's power, not human strength. As the battle raged for hours, Moses' arms grew tired and began to drop. When this happened, the Amalekites started winning and pushing Joshua's army back. Aaron and a man named Hur saw what was happening and quickly found a stone for Moses to sit on. Then they stood on both sides of him and held up his hands when he became too weak to keep them raised. Exodus chapter 17, verse 12 shows how they helped Moses maintain the position of victory. But Moses' hands were heavy, and they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat thereon. And Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on the one side and the other on the other side. And his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. With his hands held up all day, Joshua and the Hebrew army completely defeated the Amalekites. After the victory, God told Moses to write this battle in a book as a permanent memorial. He also declared that he would completely remove the memory of Amalek from under heaven because they had attacked his people. Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner," remembering how God had given them victory that day. 3 months after leaving Egypt, the Hebrew people came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped at the base of Mount Sinai. This was the same mountain where God had spoken to Moses from the burning bush and called him to deliver Israel from slavery. Now God was ready to make a covenant with the entire nation and give them his laws to live by. God told Moses to prepare the people for a special meeting. For 3 days, they had to wash their clothes, purify themselves, and get ready to hear directly from the Lord. On the 3rd day, God would come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people. They were warned not to touch the mountain or even go near it, because God's presence would make it holy and dangerous. On the morning of the 3rd day, the mountain became a terrifying sight. Exodus chapter 19 verse 18 describes what happened when God descended, and Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke, because the Lord descended upon it in fire, and the smoke thereof ascended as the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mount quaked greatly. The entire mountain was covered in thick smoke and shaking violently as God's presence filled it. Thunder crashed, lightning flashed, and a trumpet blast grew louder and louder. The people trembled with fear and stood far back from the mountain. Moses went up into the smoke and fire to meet with God, while the people waited below in amazement and terror. They could see that their God was not like the silent idols of Egypt. He was alive, powerful and awesome beyond imagination. From the fire and smoke on Mount Sinai, God spoke the 10 Commandments with his own voice so all the people could hear. These weren't suggestions or good ideas. They were direct commands from the Creator of the universe. Exodus chapter 20 verses 1 to 17 contain these fundamental laws that would govern how God's people were to live, worship, and treat each other. The first 4 commandments dealt with their relationship to God. Worship only the Lord, make no idols, don't use God's name wrongly, and keep the Sabbath day holy. The last 6 commandments govern their relationships with other people. Honor your parents, don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie about others, and don't want what belongs to your neighbor. After hearing God's voice speak these commandments, the people were so frightened, they begged Moses to speak with God for them instead. They promised to obey whatever God told Moses, but they were afraid they would die if God spoke directly to them again. Moses went back up the mountain to receive more detailed laws and instructions from God. Moses stayed on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights, receiving detailed instructions from God about how the people should worship and live as his chosen nation. But down at the base of the mountain, the Hebrew people grew impatient and worried. They couldn't see Moses anymore and didn't know what had happened to him. Up in the smoke and fire, their impatience led them to make a terrible decision that broke the very first commandment God had just given them. They went to Aaron and demanded that he make them a god they could see and worship. Exodus chapter 32 verse 1 records their faithless request. And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron, and said unto him, Up, make us gods, which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what is become of him. Aaron should have refused and reminded the people of God's commandments, but instead he gave in to their demands. He told them to bring their golden earrings and jewelry, which he melted down and formed into the shape of a calf. When the people saw the golden idol, they declared it was the god that had brought them out of Egypt. Aaron even built an altar before it and announced a festival to worship this false god. The next day, the people got up early to sacrifice to the golden calf, eat, drink, and participate in wild celebrations that dishonored the true God. Meanwhile, up on the mountain, God told Moses what was happening and threatened to destroy the entire nation for their rebellion. Moses pleaded with God to show mercy and remember his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When Moses came down from the mountain carrying the 2 stone tablets with the 10 commandments written by God's own finger, he saw the golden calf and the people dancing around it. Exodus chapter 32 verse 19 describes his response, and it came to pass, as soon as he came nigh unto the camp, that he saw the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger waxed hot, and he cast the tablets out of his hands, and brake them beneath the mount. Moses grabbed the golden calf, burned it in fire, ground it to powder, mixed it with water, and made the people drink it. He confronted Aaron about his leadership failure, then stood at the entrance of the camp and called for everyone who was still loyal to God to come stand with him. The tribe of Levi responded, and Moses commanded them to go through the camp with swords and execute those who had led the rebellion. That day, about 3,000 people died for their idolatry and rebellion against God. Moses told the remaining people that they had committed a great sin, but he would go back up the mountain to pray for God's forgiveness. The nation learned a hard lesson about the seriousness of breaking God's commandments and the importance of staying faithful even when their leader was away. After dealing with the golden calf rebellion and receiving new stone tablets to replace the ones he had broken, Moses gathered the people to share God's detailed instructions for building a portable worship center. This tent-like structure would be called the tabernacle, and it would be the place where God's presence would dwell among his people as they traveled through the wilderness. God had given Moses exact specifications for every part of the tabernacle. During his 40 days on Mount Sinai, the design was incredibly detailed, from the type of wood to use for the frame to the colors of fabric for the curtains. Everything had spiritual meaning and pointed to God's holiness, beauty, and desire to live among his people. The people responded with amazing generosity to build God's house. Exodus chapter 35 verse 21 describes their enthusiastic giving, and they came, everyone whose heart stirred him up, and everyone whom his spirit made willing. And they brought the Lord's offering to the work of the tabernacle of the congregation, and for all his service, and for the holy garments. Men and women brought gold, silver, bronze, fine fabrics, precious stones, and their skilled labor. God chose a man named Bezaleel from the tribe of Judah to be the master craftsman for the tabernacle. He was filled with God's Spirit and given supernatural skill in working with metal, wood, stone, and fabric. Along with his assistant Aholiab and other skilled workers, Bezaleel created beautiful works of art that glorified God. The tabernacle had 3 main sections: the outer courtyard where sacrifices were offered, the holy place where priests performed daily rituals, and the most holy place where God's presence dwelled above the Ark of the Covenant. Only the high priest could enter the most holy place, and only once a year, on the Day of Atonement, when the construction was finally completed exactly according to God's instructions, Moses set up the tabernacle and anointed everything with holy oil. Exodus chapter 40 verse 34 describes what happened next. Then a cloud covered the tent of the congregation, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. God's visible presence came down and filled the tabernacle, showing his approval of their work and his desire to dwell among them. The cloud of God's glory became their guide for the rest of their wilderness journey. When the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, the people knew it was time to pack up and move to the next location. When the cloud settled and remained over the tabernacle, they stayed in that place until God was ready to lead them forward again. After 40 years of leading Israel through the wilderness, Moses had become an old man of 120 years. God had sustained his strength throughout the long journey, but the time had come for him to pass the leadership to Joshua and prepare for his own death. The entire generation that had left Egypt as adults had died in the wilderness because of their unbelief. But Moses had remained faithful to the end. God told Moses to climb Mount Nebo, which overlooked the Jordan River and the Promised Land that Israel would soon enter. From this high mountain, Moses could see the land that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the land that Israel had been traveling toward for 4 decades. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 1 describes Moses' final journey, and Moses went up from the plains of Moab unto the mountain of Nebo, to the top of Pisgah that is over against Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead, unto Dan. From the mountain top, God gave Moses a supernatural vision that allowed him to see the entire Promised Land spread out before him like a beautiful map. Moses could see the forests and fields, the cities and villages, the rivers and valleys that would belong to his people. He saw the Mediterranean Sea to the west, the desert to the south, and the mountains to the north. God pointed out each region and reminded Moses of his promises to the patriarchs. This was the land flowing with milk and honey that Israel had longed to reach. But God also reminded Moses why he couldn't enter the Promised Land himself. Years earlier, when the people had complained about water, Moses had struck a rock in anger instead of speaking to it as God had commanded. Because of this act of disobedience, Moses could see the Promised Land but not enter it. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 5 records the end of Moses' life. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. God himself buried Moses in a valley in Moab, but no one knows the exact location of his grave to this day. Moses had been more than just a political leader. He was God's prophet who spoke directly with the Lord face to face. The Bible says there never arose another prophet in Israel like Moses, who knew God so intimately and performed such mighty miracles. He had led 2 million people out of slavery, received God's laws, built the tabernacle, and guided Israel through 40 years in the wilderness. Though Moses died before entering the promised land, his work was complete. He'd successfully delivered God's people from Egypt and prepared them to possess the land God had promised their ancestors. Joshua would lead them across the Jordan River, but Moses would always be remembered as the great liberator who heard God's call and obeyed, despite his fears and weaknesses. If this incredible story of faith, miracles, and God's faithfulness has touched your heart, please hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you won't miss more amazing Bible stories like this one. Share this video with your family and friends who need to hear about God's power to deliver and transform lives. Your support helps us continue bringing these timeless stories of faith to people around the world. What part of Moses' story impacted you the most? Leave a comment below and let us know how God is working in your own life. Remember, the same God who heard the cries of his people in Egypt hears your prayers today. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.